My stepmother, Denise, set her wine glass down so hard the stem snapped, sending a thin red line across the white tablecloth like something bleeding. She didn't build up to it. She detonated it, right in the middle of the dinner I had planned and half-cooked myself on the 3rd anniversary of my father's death, inside the house he'd built with his own hands for a woman who wasn't even in the room to see what had become of it. "Sign it, Margot," she said, sliding a thin folder across the table until it touched my plate. "Just initial where Frank marked it, and we can all stop pretending this is complicated." A quitclaim deed. My name on it, a signature line waiting, and beneath it, language I recognized instantly from a decade of reading fine print for a living, language that would sign away any claim I had to the house my parents built before I'd even asked why it existed. "I'd like my own attorney to look at this first," I said, calm, the way I sounded when a client tried to slip something past me at work. Denise's face went the color of the wine she'd just spilled. Beside her, my stepbrother Cole leaned back with the smugness of a man who already believed he'd won, arms crossed, waiting for the show. Frank, her boyfriend of 8 months, studied the tablecloth like it had suddenly become fascinating. "Then get out," Denise snapped. "Tonight. If you won't sign it, you don't get to live here pretending you're still part of this family." No one at that table defended me. Not Cole. Not Frank. Not even the framed photo of my father on the sideboard, 3 years gone, and still somehow expected to referee a fight he never would have allowed. I want to be clear about one thing. I did not cry. Not one tear, not then. I am Margot Calloway, 29 years old, a senior actuary who has spent a decade being paid to calculate exactly how much risk a stranger's life can absorb before something breaks and some quiet, professional part of me had already run those numbers on my own life the second that folder touched my plate. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to reconsider. I put my napkin down, the way my mother taught me before she died, and stood up slowly enough that my chair didn't even scrape the floor. "All right," I told her. "I'll get my things." They thought they'd just watched me lose everything. None of them, not Denise, not Cole, not even Frank, who I'd later learn had pushed for that deed in the first place, had any idea that my father had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly arranging things so that this exact dinner could never actually cost me anything at all. If you enjoy watching calm women hand out consequences instead of tears, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because Denise had absolutely no idea what she'd just started. 3 days. That's how long it took me to stop replaying that table on a loop every time I closed my eyes. I hadn't gone far that first night, just 11 miles to a small inn near the plaza, thick adobe walls, a fireplace in every room. I stood in the doorway with 2 suitcases and my laptop bag and, for the first time in 3 years, heard nothing. No television bleeding through walls. No truck idling in the driveway at 2 a.m. Just the hum of the mini fridge and my own breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my laptop, and did the one thing that had always made me feel steady. When everything else tilted, I pulled up my accounts. $186,000. Built dollar by dollar since I was 22, untouched by anyone but me, even while I'd spent 3 years quietly covering the property taxes on a house that was never technically mine, replacing a well pump the same month my father's headstone arrived, and paying half a semester of community college for a stepbrother, who dropped out 2 months later without a word of thanks. I had told myself for 3 years that keeping that house running was the same as keeping my father's memory alive. Sitting in that hotel room, I finally admitted the truth. I hadn't been preserving anything. I had been funding my own erasure from a house my parents built together, one utility bill at a time. I opened a message thread I'd been avoiding for almost a year, from Priya Nakashima, my closest friend since graduate school, and a residential appraiser who had spent that year gently, then not so gently, telling me to stop treating my own life like a line item in someone else's budget. Territorial style, Tasuk foothills. Mountain views, casita included, listed Tuesday at $430,000. You need to see this before someone else does. I'd brushed it off in the spring, certain I needed to stay in the house my parents built. Looking at those photos again now, that isolated little property in the hills didn't feel like abandoning their memory. It felt like the first honest decision I'd made in 3 years. I did the math quickly, the way I did everything. 40% down on a house like that came to $172,000, well within reach, with enough left over that I wouldn't be starting my new life running on fumes. I had, without ever quite admitting it to myself, been pre-approved for exactly this kind of loan for 8 months already, as though some self-protective part of me had known this night was coming. I texted Priya, asking her to get me into that house first thing in the morning, before I could talk myself out of it again. 8 a.m. Already called the agent. Get some sleep, you're going to want to be sharp for this one. I closed the laptop and looked out at the dark shape of the mountains against the sky. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't planning my life around what my father's house needed from me. I was planning it around what I needed from mine. By the following week, I stood in the kind of morning light that only exists in northern New Mexico, thin, gold, impossibly clean, holding the keys to a house that belonged to no one but me. The property sat at the end of a dirt road lined with pinyon and juniper, adobe walls the color of the hills themselves, a kiva fireplace built into the corner of the living room, windows positioned so precisely that sunrise poured across the floor, like it had been designed for exactly that purpose. A small guest casita sat out back, its own door, its own quiet. I signed at a title company downtown, wired the down payment, and drove up alone that same afternoon with gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. I unlocked the door and stood in the empty living room, listening to nothing but wind moving through the piñons outside. For 3 years, I had measured safety by how well I managed someone else's house. Standing in my own empty living room, dust drifting gold in the afternoon light, I understood for the first time that safety had never been about the walls at all. It had been about who got to decide what happened inside them. That evening, sitting on the low adobe wall of my new patio with my knees pulled to my chest, I finally let myself cry, not from grief for what I'd lost, but from something embarrassingly close to relief. 2 days after closing, I drove back into town for a conversation I'd been avoiding for 3 years, a real sit-down with Harlan Voss, the trust and estate attorney who had handled my father's affairs since before I was born. Harlan's office sat above a bookstore near the plaza, exposed Vegas, towering shelves, the smell of cedar and old paper. He'd known my father 30 years. He'd stood at the funeral. He'd sent a card on the first anniversary of Dad's death that I still kept in my desk drawer. I laid the quitclaim folder on his desk beside a copy of my father's death certificate and the original deed to the Casa Solana house, and told him everything: the dinner, the folder Denise slid across the table, the ultimatum, the 11 miles I'd driven with everything I owned in 2 suitcases. Harlan went very still. He put on his reading glasses, opened the folder, and read for a long moment before he spoke. "Margot," he said finally, "did your father ever mention the trust we set up the year after he married Denise?" I told him no. I had no idea what he meant. What he explained over the next hour rearranged everything I understood about my father's death. 3 years before he died, back when Denise was still new to our family, when everyone was still on their best behavior, my father had sat in this same office and told Harlan he was worried. Not about Denise exactly, but about what could happen after he was gone, in a family stitched together the way blended families sometimes are, where loyalty doesn't always run in straight lines. So instead of leaving me the house outright, which Harlan had warned could create exactly this kind of tension, my father restructured the property into what Harlan called a defeasible life estate. Denise could live there as long as she wanted, rent-free, undisturbed, on one non-negotiable condition. If she ever tried to force me out of my inheritance, pressured me to sign away my interest in the property, or took any deliberate action to dispossess me of what my father intended for me to have, her right to occupy the house would terminate immediately, and full ownership would pass to me. Not half. All of it. He made me put it in writing 3 separate ways. Harlan told me, because he said if it ever came to this, he didn't want a single loophole for anyone's lawyer to find. He knew exactly what he was protecting you from, Margot. He just hoped to God he'd never have to be right about it. The Casa Solana house itself, Harlan mentioned almost as an aside, had last been informally appraised at just under $560,000, a number that suddenly meant something entirely different than it had that morning. I sat in that leather chair and felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. My father, gone 3 years, unable to raise his voice at that dinner table, unable to defend me the way I'd silently wished he could that night, had defended me anyway. 3 years in advance, in a lawyer's office, in writing, because he knew his own wife better than she apparently knew herself. Then Harlan told me the part that turned my grief into something considerably sharper. That quitclaim deed Denise had tried to get me to sign wasn't just an insult. It was evidence, a dated, notarized attempt to strip me of an inheritance my father had explicitly protected, the exact triggering condition written into the trust 3 years earlier. She hadn't just tried to force me out. She had walked directly into the one trap my father built specifically to catch her in the act. Any idea? Harlan asked. Why she suddenly needed this sign now, after 3 years of doing nothing at all? I didn't. Not yet. But I had a feeling Frank did. It took less than a week to find out. Priya recognized Frank's name the moment I said it out loud over coffee at my new kitchen counter. He wasn't just Denise's boyfriend of 8 months. He was a small-time property investor 2 counties over, the kind of man who read county property records the way other people scrolled social media, looking for equity sitting in houses owned by people who didn't understand what they had. He'd pulled the deed history on the Casa Solana house, found my name buried in trust paperwork as a remainder interest holder, and realized the house wasn't fully Denise's to offer him a stake in after all. He hadn't told her the whole truth of what he'd found, just enough to panic her into thinking she needed to lock down ownership before I figured it out myself, and that a quitclaim deed at a family dinner was the fastest, quietest way to make the problem disappear. Denise had walked into that dinner thinking she was closing a loophole. She had no idea she was triggering one. I sat with that information for exactly 1 evening. Then I stopped waiting for anyone to apologize, and I started closing every door I had quietly been holding open for people who had never once considered closing one for me. The next morning, coffee going lukewarm beside my laptop, I finally read through 11 months of statements on the joint household credit card I'd opened back when Dad first got sick, meant strictly for groceries, prescriptions, and utilities. I'd told myself for months I hadn't had time to check it closely. The truth was I hadn't wanted to look, because looking meant admitting what I already suspected, that Cole had been quietly running up charges for detailing supplies, for a side business he never actually built into anything. Fast food delivery 3 or 4 nights a week, a tattoo, a fantasy football buy-in. Small enough each time that I could talk myself into not noticing. Add up enough small things you refuse to notice, and eventually they become a pattern you can't unsee. I called the card issuer, removed Cole as an authorized user, and canceled the account entirely before I'd even finished my coffee. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Cole, standing at the parts counter of the shop where he sometimes detailed cars for cash, trying to buy $300 of ceramic coating for a client waiting on him. My card just got declined, he said, no hello. Fix it. There's nothing to fix, I told him, keeping my voice level. I closed the account this morning. You're not an authorized user anymore. You can't just do that. I already did. He hung up mid-sentence, shouting at someone nearby about how unbelievable this was. I set the phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee. Denise called 40 minutes later, her voice shaking with a fury I recognized immediately as fear wearing anger's clothes. I'd humiliated her son in public. I still owed the household my share. Walking away without paying my part wasn't how decent people behaved. I let her finish. Then, calmly, I told her that decent people didn't slide legal documents across a dinner table, and threatened to throw family out onto the street on the anniversary of a man's death. The house had never been hers to begin with, and she might spend less time rehearsing outrage and more time finding an attorney of her own. I hung up before she could respond, and I did not mention that Harlan's certified letter was already scheduled to arrive at her door in 2 days. It arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by a process server Harlan had hired specifically so there could be no argument later about whether she'd received it. 6 pages, Plain but unforgiving, that Denise's life estate in the Casa Solana property had been conditioned on her not interfering with, pressuring, or dispossessing Margot Calloway of her remainder interest. That on the night of our anniversary dinner she had done exactly that, both verbally and through a notarized quitclaim deed presented for signature, and that as a direct result, her right to occupy the premises had already terminated, with full ownership passing immediately and irrevocably to me. 30 days to vacate. I wasn't there when she read it, and some small, still decent part of me was almost grateful for that. What I do know is that by that evening my phone showed 11 missed calls and 4 voicemails, and by morning, the tone in every one of them had changed completely. The fury had burned itself out. What was left underneath it was panic. She left messages the way people do when the ground has genuinely disappeared beneath them, rambling, tearful, circling the same handful of phrases. That she hadn't meant any of it. That Frank had pressured her more than she wanted to admit. That surely we could sit down like family, no lawyers, no 30-day deadlines, no locksmith. I let every call go to voicemail. I sat on my patio in the evenings, wrapped against the high desert chill, and listened to her voice crack in real time without feeling a single thing move in my chest. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply the absence of anything left for her to spend. By Friday, the voicemail stopped and a text arrived instead, shorter, more composed, clearly drafted with more care than the ones before it, a request to meet in person, somewhere neutral, before things went any further. I waited until Saturday to reply and made sure she understood exactly what kind of meeting she was asking for. A small cafe 2 blocks off the plaza. Harlan would be joining us. Anything discussed would be part of the formal record, not a family conversation over lattes. Denise arrived first, which surprised me. Cole came in a few minutes later, slouched into the chair beside her like a man who'd been dragged somewhere against his will. Harlan and I sat across from them with a stack of documents between us that Denise, I noticed, couldn't quite bring herself to look at directly. She started exactly as I expected, glassy eyes, trembling voice, a story about how hard the last 3 years had been for her too, how she'd never meant for things to go this far, how surely there was a version of this where she and Cole could stay a little longer while they figured out next steps. Harlan let her finish completely. Then, without raising his voice, he opened the folder and laid the trust document, the dated quitclaim deed, and the county recording of my remainder interest side by side between the coffee cups. Miss Calloway isn't asking you to leave because she wants revenge, he said. She's not asking at all. The trust your late husband created did that automatically, the moment you tried to force his daughter out of her own inheritance. Everything happening here is simply honoring what he already put in writing. I watched something in Denise's face fold in on itself as the reality landed, not as an accusation from me, but as a fact that had been sitting quietly in a filing cabinet for 3 years, waiting. Before she could regroup into another round of pleading, I set one more piece of paper on the table, a letter to my auto insurer, removing Cole as a listed driver on the policy covering the truck loan I'd co-signed 18 months earlier, back when his credit wasn't strong enough to qualify on his own. Cole sat forward so fast his chair scraped the floor. You can't do that. I need that truck for work. You need insurance to legally drive it, I said. As of Monday, you won't have any through me. If you want to keep the truck, you're welcome to refinance it in your own name. I'm sure your credit union will be thrilled to discuss your payment history. He didn't have a response to that because we both already knew what his credit history looked like. Denise reached across the table and grabbed my wrist, her voice climbing toward the register she'd used at that dinner 3 weeks earlier. You're trying to destroy us. I looked down at her hand until she let go on her own. No, I said. I'm doing exactly what my father already decided should happen if you ever did what you did at that table. I didn't write that trust, Denise. You triggered it. The 30-day deadline came and went without a single filing in probate court because Harlan had been right from the beginning. There was nothing left to contest. Denise's attorney, a general practice lawyer from 2 towns over who had clearly never handled a contested trust in his life, sent one half-hearted request for an extension, then went quiet entirely once he'd actually read the language himself. Frank, as it turned out, had considerably less patience for a woman with no house, no equity, and no claim to either than he'd had for a woman who appeared to have both. Priya heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that he'd stopped returning Denise's calls almost the same week the notice went out, once it became clear the investment he'd been circling had evaporated, into a legal document he should have read more carefully, before he ever suggested that quitclaim deed in the first place. Denise and Cole moved into a small rental on the west side of Albuquerque, an hour south, close enough to Denise's sister to stay with her while the lease got sorted out. Cole, no longer able to legally insure the truck, sold it at a loss and started riding the bus to a full-time position at the same dealership where he'd once only detailed cars for cash on the side. Harlan mentioned, months later, that the two of them argued constantly in that cramped apartment, each one certain the other was to blame for a fall neither of them had seen coming. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard it. I felt something quieter than that. Something closer to closure. For months after that dinner, I sat on the low adobe wall of my back patio with Priya, 2 mugs of coffee between us and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains catching the last gold light of evening. Pinion smoke drifted in from a neighbor's chimney, and for the first time in longer than I could easily count, my chest didn't feel like it was bracing for the next phone call. Priya asked, not for the first time, whether I ever regretted how quickly everything had happened: the house, the trust, the letter, the cafe, all of it compressed into a handful of months after 3 years of silence. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I didn't regret a single part of it. Not the dinner, not the 11 miles I drove that first night with everything I owned in 2 suitcases, not the morning I stood in an empty living room and finally understood what safety actually meant. My father hadn't left me a house. He'd left me proof, 3 years in advance, in a lawyer's office, in writing, that he'd seen exactly who Denise might become long before I was willing to admit it myself, and that he'd built something sturdier than any of us to protect me from it. The Casa Solana house itself I couldn't quite bring myself to sell outright, not yet. These days it sits rented to a young family 2 streets over from where I grew up, the rent quietly funding a small scholarship at the community college in my father's name, the same program Cole walked away from without finishing a single semester. On the small table beside my chair sat the one thing I'd taken from that house before I left it that night, a small clay pot my mother had made in a pottery class the year before she got sick, glazed the deep turquoise blue she loved, chipped slightly on one side from 29 years of being moved from shelf to shelf. It didn't belong in a house that no longer had anything to do with either of my parents. It belonged here, in a home that was entirely, unmistakably mine. I had spent 3 years believing that honoring my parents meant keeping their house exactly as it was, no matter what it cost me. Sitting in the quiet of my own patio, mountains going violet in the last of the light, I finally understood that my father's actual legacy had never been a house at all. It was the plan he had quietly built to make sure I never had to choose between loving him and protecting myself. I raised my coffee mug slightly toward the mountains, took a slow sip, let the evening settle around me, and did not look back.